here's an interesting stat. I'm going to interrupt you real quick, and then I want you to get right back on this track. The supply of single family existing homes is pretty close to a record low still. So these are existing homes that have been built, that are built and have been built.
Yeah, used houses.
Yes. New houses, the supply is approaching the 2005, 2006 highs.
Yeah.
So that's evidence for what you're about to say.
Well, people that have owned houses for any more than 3 years are sitting on decent amounts of home equity and nice low interest rates. And those two things, when you compare to buying a more expensive house or even a similarly priced house with a higher interest rate, it's hard to want to financially do it. But what I think we're starting to see, I think the stat for like average home ownership is like 7 years. Like on average, when you buy a house, you own it for 7 years, then you sell it. I think what we're starting to see is that a lot of people are getting towards year 7 of their homes that they own. They're getting kind of long in the tooth for how long they've been in these houses, and their life circumstances have changed. And when I bought my house, we were dinks, dual income, no kids, completely different situation. And we loved that house for that. But as we had kids, as we started a business, as COVID happened, our life changed, and it didn't meet the needs anymore. And I think what's happening is millions of Americans out there are facing this. They're looking down and going, gosh, like, can we make a change out of our house? And it's a big can, because the other problem is that there's been a lot of inflation in the last few years. People's budgets have gotten pretty tight. And because the interest rates are more expensive, I mean, I've had clients, I've seen situations where, you know, maybe you want to improve your financial situation. And so you think about, should we sell our house? Like, would that help my budget if we took our house and sold it and bought a less expensive house? But the hard part is, like, it's really hard to get better than a 2 or a 3% interest rate when rates are 7%. I don't care how much the adjustment you would need to make to downsize to get the same monthly cost, it's big.
I'm going to go ahead and go right into the podcast. Welcome to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ben Jones.
I'm Brent Gargano.
Today, we're talking about housing, specifically U.S. housing, and we have some anecdotal experiences to share because, Brent, how long ago was it that you bought your house?
We closed at the end of September.
So you did the millennial parent thing. You moved from the inner 275 loop to the burbs.
We moved from a house, in the city limits.
Yeah.
Little tiny house that we were outgrowing, and we had been outgrowing for several years, and made the move to the burbs.
Yeah. So how did you end up in Oakley in the first place? That's where you lived, right? It was Oakley.
Yeah. Well, I mean, essentially we settled there after college. I mean, after college, I moved in with a buddy that I had known from college, and that happened to be in Oakley. And for people that live outside of Cincinnati, Oakley's a 100 and some year old community that has been revitalized in Cincinnati. So all the old the old train tracks are now a walking path, and you have nice restaurants and these $1 million condos that are going up all over the place. And it's super walkable. It's a great spot for what they call dinks, dual income, no kids. What they call it in the neighborhood. Of course, we outgrew our dink stage about 5 years ago. And so, like I said, it's since then we felt this ever growing pressure that, like, we need just a little more space and privacy. So.
Yep. So you came out to, I think you ended up to Loveland. So tell us about your home buying experience. What was that like?
Oh man. I mean, so on the buy side, there's a lot of competition still. At least that was my experience.
That was just, 2-3 months ago?
A few months ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it was towards the end of the summer. Maybe you're just getting into the school year. I thought that was to my advantage. The suburbs are very school year driven, and my kids aren't old enough to care yet. And so we actually ended up in a competitive buying situation, or potentially competitive buying situation. I was told that they were going to get another offer. They were expecting to get another offer in addition to mine. So when I made my offer, I essentially gave them more money if they accepted my offer in a shorter period of time. I said, if you answer me before 9 a.m. tomorrow, I'll give you extra money.
Which I thought was brilliant. And by the way, how much of a scam is it that realtors will say, oh, you better put an offer in now because there's more interest. It's like, well, there's always interest. Well, when are they ever going to tell you?
That was but you have to make a judgment call. I think, what as advisors, we've bought our own houses and we've done these things for ourselves, but we've also coached other people through these kinds of things. And you do realize that if you like if it's the house, you're probably going to pay about whatever you need to pay. And so I'm not saying, obviously there are limits, but I didn't want to end up in a situation, like I knew that my wife was sold on this house, and I didn't want to end up in a situation the next day where it's like, we are in a bidding war and how high are you willing to go? That just wasn't a situation. So I actually asked my realtor, I said, I asked him, have you seen Shark Tank? Have you seen when Mark Cuban looks at looks at the people and says, I'll give you exactly what you want, but you can't talk to any of the other sharks?
Yes.
I said, how do we do that?
Yeah.
And we ended up coming up with this strategy of offering less, but then adding more money to get to what they were asking, but putting in an expiration date that essentially didn't give them enough time to go talk to the other sharks, so to speak.
So what you're saying is, in order to get a good deal on a house today, you have to be an a-hole like Mark Cuban.
I'm not saying, I don't know that Mark Cuban's whatever. But
well, yeah, he's shrewd.
I think shrewd is the right way to look at it.
Yeah.
You have to be, you have to be thoughtful about how you want to approach it. I think the point, getting back to your question, in today's real estate market, and we have another podcast where we've talked about strategies on making offers and such, but you're not going to be able to easily put an offer on a house that's conditional on selling your house. So you have to find a way to make sure you could either, finance this thing separately, buy it in cash and refinance it later, or afford to own both houses at the same time. You remember when you were younger and you went to buy your first house and you kind of laughed at the number the bank approved you for because you're like, oh, this is way more than I can spend. Well, now they have to approve you for a number that's big enough to own both of your houses on it.
Yes.
Right. And that changes that math a little bit. You really want them to approve you for a bigger number when you are going to have to buy your new house that you want to spend probably more than your old house on. And even though you plan to sell your old house, be able to afford both at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different. So yeah, I think it's important to be purposeful. And so back to your point, I don't know. That's where I think a good realtor comes in, because I really had to, for better or for worse, trust the judgment of my realtor to assess like how credible is the fact that they like are expecting one other offer. And so he, whether that's true or not, I'll take, I will never know, I suppose.
Yeah, your realtor kind of does a job helping you get the inside scoop. How much of this is smoke and mirrors versus how much of it is actually reality? Is the price that you're looking to sell at or buy at, is it realistic? Now, it's an art form, not a science.
Well, and just talking to the other realtor, where they're independent third parties that are kind of, well, here's how my buyers feel, right? And they can say that in a nicer way than me as the buyer or me as the seller, might say. So it's kind of like having lawyers that can talk on your behalf. These two people don't have personal beef with each other and aren't actually on two sides of the deal. So having them to kind of talk in between could either be a really bad thing because you don't know what they're saying and how much of your information they're kind of, what they know, or it could be a really good thing if they themselves are shrewd and know how to make sure that you're getting the right information and you're not getting taken advantage of. So
Well, you certainly pay for that. So realtor commissions are not cheap because
And they're negotiable now.
well, on the buyer's side,
No,
on the seller side too, it's always been negotiable.
Yeah.
But
So when I talked to my realtor, I mean, one of the conversations we had was to fill out a form that says, here's my commission. And it was interesting because if I thought what was kind of screwy about it, because now we're moving to the side of selling my house.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked to my realtor about selling the house, and he's asking, what kind of commission are you going to pay me?
Mm-hmm.
And normal is 3% or whatever, right? And if I could say I'll pay you 2, or no, we were going to. Sorry, I mixed up. What we were talking about was how much are we going to pay the buyer's agent?
Yes,
right. So buyer's agent normally would get paid 3. I can offer to only pay them 2. But then if the buyer's agent has negotiated with the buyer that they're going to get paid 3, then you have to get into this conversation around who's coming up with the extra 1%.
Exactly.
Right. And then I asked my realtor,
and that can be a lot. So on a $500,000 home, you're talking $5,000.
Yeah, that's not small money.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of back to you've got to trust your realtor.
Mm-hmm.
I asked my realtor, I said, so if I say I'm going to pay the buyer's agent 2, I was like, when their realtor calls you, how does that sound in your conversation?
Yeah.
Is that other realtor like, how much are you going to pay me? And if it's less than 3, they're like gonna.
Yeah, they're gonna. They're not going to show your house.
They're not going to want to show the house.
And how much of a conflict of interest does that present? Can you imagine being a realtor that decides, oh, well, that house is only going to pay me 2%, so I'm not going to show that. Now, I don't think that that's possible to do if you have clients that are paying attention, because you can see the houses on Zillow, Redfin, Realtor.com. They're all there. And the inventory is still so thin that anything that piques your interest is easy to identify. So I don't think it's quite possible.
But you just wonder what that conversation sounds like, realtor to realtor, with nobody else is listening.
Yeah.
And they're talking about that structure. We could pick on financial advisors in the same way. I mean, as advisors, I'm sure all of us, we've come across people that behind the scenes are very commission driven or income driven, right? And it's just not. It doesn't come across well.
Well, the reason why I think realtor fees, when you consider all what they do, are fair. But the real disadvantage I think realtors have when they're marketing their services is that I would say about 80% of what they do is done gratis. It's a loss leader, showing houses, taking on clients, educating them. They don't get paid a nickel until there's a transaction. And most of the work that goes into what realtors do doesn't involve transactions. It's more relationship management, expectation management. So I know I work with quite a few realtors. I have friends that are realtors, and I know the work that they put in. They are not lazy people. And what really is happening is that the few transactions that go through subsidize all that work that they do with a lot of clients or potential clients that end up not doing anything.
Sure.
So, and that's just the reality. And I've thought about well, how do you change the system to not be that way? And the only way I could think of is if the whole real estate model, and it would take every agency would have to do this at the same time. They would have to all transfer it over to a subscription-based service. And I just don't think that's ever going to happen, because right now the free market has determined that the current compensation system we have now is the one that works. So it's what we're stuck with.
We'll start to see. I mean, I think it's very similar to what advisors have gone through. As fees and compensations compressed. It's not that the best, the advisors and the realtors that really work to add real value as opposed to just kind of get involved in a transaction, still, get compensated similarly, but they're eventually you see more solutions get involved that are less, they hold your hand less. They do less of it for you. They're more transactional, but there are costs that will probably drop. So, one of the things that we looked at getting into this meeting was Redfin this month released a report that talks about the state of the housing market and some predictions for 2025. One of their predictions is that fees on the whole for real estate transactions will start to compress. So
Especially, and they basically,
especially in the higher end.
Correct.
You think about selling a $10 million home.
Yeah.
And the time that takes versus selling a $2 million home.
What's funny about real estate is that generally the higher dollar homes are less work for realtors than the lower dollar homes, because the higher dollar homes typically are owned by people who maintain them better because they've obviously got more cash flow to afford the home. So you typically have less issues, structural issues and that sort of thing. So funny enough, the amount of work that a realtor has to do to sell a lower value home is typically more than a higher value home, but you get paid more for the higher value home. So you can see how that there's an imbalance there. But one thing that I did want to comment on before we get into the 2025 predictions, because these are fun and we're going to have a lot of discussion points around these, is the current state of the housing market. Because you bought a house about 3-4 months ago. I'm in the middle of buying a house right now.
I was going to say,
in fact,
you're
as
buying
I'm sitting
a
here,
house.
As I'm sitting here, my realtor's texting me saying, "You forgot to initial this document." Can we pause for a second and just talk about how ridiculous the volume of forms you have to sign is? I bought a house in 2013. I remember doing it. Nowhere near the amount of forms that exist just 11 years later. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and they're all electronic now. So, of course, you're reviewing everything before you sign it, right?
Oh, no. Actually, this system called Dot Loop, which, funny enough, I went to school with the kid, Austin, that started it. He's actually a brilliant guy. He sold it to Zillow. Guy's probably multimillionaire, living his best life. But I actually opened his first bank account for that business at National City Bank. He came in with all this venture capital money and he's like, "I need to set up an account." And I'm like, he was at the time, he's probably like 21, 22. I was like, what is this guy doing? Anyway.
And years later, you're signing all of your real estate documents through that same.
It's mind blowing. It's actually really exciting. Super happy for the guy. Just brilliant dude.
What credit do you get? Like, where is your name listed in the footnotes?
I deserve no credit because I get there.
Here is the bank guy that
I didn't have the idea. I didn't have the balls to do what this guy did, and that's borrow a ton of rich people's money and risk it on an idea.
Yeah.
But it panned out for him and good for him. But anyway, I digress. So the one gripe I have about Dot Loop, and this is true for any like DocuSign or anything, I'm not picking on Dot Loop, but what it does is it skips past all the germane material. It just skips it all. It just says, we know you're going to ignore it. So we're just going to just fast forward through it, go straight to the signing section. Dot Loop actually goes one step further and it zooms in on the sign here part. So it actually cuts out all the language that you're supposed to read. So it's purposefully designed with the knowledge that you are going to ignore all this.
So I just had an experience recently with Charles Schwab.
Yeah.
I'll call out Schwab here because I told him I would call him out. I thought it was a little ridiculous. We're trying to open a new account and the date of birth got messed up on the DocuSign. It wasn't there. DocuSign tries to pull all of the pre-filled data and not all the time does it. Longer story. But so Schwab wants to know the client's date of birth to open the account. And first, they tell me to send them a driver's license. State issued ID, has a date of birth. So I send it to them and they say, actually, we can't use the driver's license. We need you to resend the document with the date of birth corrected and have the client re-sign the document. So, of course, I naturally ask, like, which one do you think is a more legitimate, supporting documentation for the date of birth?
Yeah.
The e-sign that I put whatever numbers I want on that the client is not going to look at.
Yes.
That they're then going to sign off on.
Yeah.
Or the state issued government ID that I just sent you
Which
via.
Which source is more legitimate?
Like,
right?
Which one do you feel like is more representative of the accuracy of their date of birth? And I just, so anyway, they ended up granting me the exception and it wasn't a big deal. But I just thought, the DocuSigns have maybe gone a little too far.
It's not DocuSign.
Well, the
DocuSign is just pointing out DocuSign is a solution to the problem, and that problem is too much paperwork. We have too much daggone paperwork for everything. I had to sign a document for my loan, for the mortgage that I'm getting, that acknowledged to the mortgage provider that I am declining home purchase education. There's literally a class that I'm supposed to take. I've owned a home. I've been a homeowner for almost 2 decades, and I have to sign a document educating me on what it's like to own a home. I actually had to sign that document. What a waste of time that is. And if it weren't for DocuSign or whatever electronic system we use, I think in that case we used Adobe Sign, I would have had to physically print that out, read it. I would have felt obligated to read it and then sign it. What a waste of time. It's all just a waste of time.
Yeah, so maybe the better way of saying it is maybe this bureaucracy and the level of paperwork.
Yeah, this tangent's run its course. The point is paperwork is absurd. And if there's anything AI can help us with, it is to digest all this legalese and put it into a 1-page bullet point list of pros and cons. Here's how you're getting screwed. Here's how you're benefiting. That's all you basically need. And we sign that one document. Instead, what we have is literally hundreds of pages of documents that we sign. And I just want to buy a deck house. I don't want to read a dissertation. I don't want to read that. It's absurd. And half the stuff I was reading, I did read some of it because I felt like, wow, if I don't read it, I'm, being an idiot. I'm a bad financial advisor. I'm just a bad consumer. I was it numbed my mind. It literally was like acid being poured into my ear. And I just didn't want to hassle with it. So anyway, that's the tangent. I'm done with it. We can move on. We all hate paperwork. So
what else have you learned you're in the middle of buying the house?
What I've learned is that the same forces driving the market from 2021 are driving the market today. And that is there's not enough inventory. My wife and I looked and looked and looked and looked. We've been looking for 2 years. And our ideal home has never come up. Now, we have seen homes that we liked and we're like, wow, that would be ideal. But then you look and you're like, listing price $1.82 million. We're like, no, I don't think I want it to my current mortgage payment is ridiculously low. I'm not going to say it because it's going to make people jealous, but I have a 2.5% rate.
You and everybody else that bought a house before.
Do the math. I bought my house in 2013, 2.5% rate. At the current rate, we're going to have it paid off in 6 years. The payment is ridiculous. So if I bought actually what I'm going into now, my payment is 3x what it is now, but that's fine. The reason why we decided to move is because we have 4 kids and we're kind of busting at the seams in our house. And our kids, when they start driving, we literally are we're going to have to hire a valet service to handle the parking because it was going to get crazy. It already is crazy with just my wife and I. So we really, that was one of the primary motivators for me, was just a bigger driveway, but also too, it's like we have 4 kids. We have, we're 2 of them are sharing a bedroom. Eventually they're not going to want to do that. And, first world problems, right? Yeah. The reality is I
think the point is that regardless, here is my belief is that regardless of the interest rate you have, because I just did the same. My old interest rate, I think was 2.8 something, very affordable mortgage payment. I was very sad to pay off the loan. But we were outgrowing the house. We had probably outgrown the house 3 years ago. And there was just like, it was kind of time. And eventually we capitulated.
Yeah.
And I think back to the low supply, and we're starting to see some supply come online. So that's starting to work. Some of it is starting to work its way out in the data, but the low supply, a lot of it's driven by So
here's an interesting stat. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and I want you to get right back on this track. The supply of single family existing homes is pretty close to a record low still. So these are existing homes that have been built, that are built and have been built.
Yeah, used houses.
Yes. New houses, the supply is approaching the 2005, 2006 highs.
Yeah.
So that's evidence for what you're about to say.
Well, people that have owned houses for any more than 3 years are sitting on decent amounts of home equity and nice low interest rates. And those two things, when you compare to buying a more expensive house or even a similarly priced house with a higher interest rate, it's hard to want to financially do it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think we're starting to see, I think the stat for like average home ownership is like 7 years. Like on average, when you buy a house, you own it for 7 years, then you sell it. I think what we're starting to see is that a lot of people are getting towards year 7 of their homes that they own. They're getting kind of long in the tooth for how long they've been in these houses, and their life circumstances have changed. And when I bought my house, we were dinks, dual income, no kids, completely different situation. And we loved that house for that. But as we had kids, as we started a business, as COVID happened, our life changed, and it didn't meet the needs anymore. And I think what's happening is millions of Americans out there are facing this. They're looking down and going, gosh, like, can we make a change out of our house? And it's a big can, because the other problem is that there's been a lot of inflation in the last few years. People's budgets have gotten pretty tight. And because the interest rates are more expensive, I mean, I've had clients, I've seen situations where, you know, maybe you want to improve your financial situation. And so you think about, should we sell our house? Like, would that help my budget if we took our house and sold it and bought a less expensive house? But the hard part is, like, it's really hard to get better than a 2 or a 3% interest rate when rates are 7%. I don't care how much I mean, the adjustment you would need to make to downsize to get the same monthly cost, it's big.
Well, you'd have to essentially get a mud hut. So, anecdote here, I had a couple in my office yesterday, and they decided they had to move to Virginia Beach from the Cincinnati area. And they ended up, they made the decision that they're going to rent Virginia Beach because it's a temporary kind of situation. And then they're going to lease out their home here. They're going to keep their home here. And when they put their house up for market, I guess like you go to rent.com or whatever and find some tenants, they said the majority of the applications they couldn't accept because the rent that they were asking was greater than 50% of the applicant's income. And they didn't want to take that. They thought that's not only bad it's risky for them, and it's bad for the tenant. They eventually did lease it out to someone who could afford it. But I just thought that was an interesting anecdote that the majority of the applicants felt that they could afford that. Maybe they didn't think that. They were just, the options were few and far between, and they just felt forced to.
I think housing has just gotten really
Housing has
expensive.
gotten crazy expensive. In fact, on this Redfin stat that you sent me, it's grown year over year 6%. So the forces that have been driving housing, demographic changes, millennials getting older, having kids, outgrowing their living situation, plus just the population generally growing, is continuing to drive the market today. Also the stickiness. So people deciding that I'm just stuck. I'm gonna stick here like a tick. I got a 2.5%, 3% mortgage. It's putting a lot of strain on inventory. Now home builders are doing what they can to catch up with it. That's why we're seeing this stat of, new homes being built is reaching 2006 levels, which, normally I'd say that's cause for concern, but I think that the demographic, we need to have it. So, that I think that builders are doing what they can to alleviate that, but there's just not a lot of inventory. When you don't have a lot of inventory, you have buyers bidding on fewer properties. That's a recipe for price appreciation. And you're going to continue to see that. I think this is a good time to segue into Redfin's 2025 predictions. But I will say, during my home purchasing experience, which I'm in the middle of right now, we bought a home, and there were, after the first or second day of listing, there were probably 3 serious buyers already for this home. And we went in aggressive because the last home that my wife and I bid on, we got outbid because it was the same situation. And that was, early summer. So we thought, we're going to go in. We basically paid full asking price, essentially, with very little concession. So now whether that was necessary or not, only the seller knows. We don't know what other offers they were considering. But if we were to believe the realtor, and I think the realtor that they were using, the seller's agent, has a very good reputation, and they've been a realtor for 50 plus years, and they're known to people that I know that are realtors, and the person is.
So you trusted them?
Yeah, I trust that even though the agent was representing the sellers, they have no interest in. And, actually they're disincentivized to telling me the truth. I do think that this person's kind of made it in their career and they don't really need the sales. So they're just going to be honest.
I also think back to your realtor, it's important that you have a realtor that can also
to actually provide me that feedback on reputation.
And like going back to mine, I remember exactly what happened. My realtor said, Brent, like, I don't know exactly if there's another offer, but when we went and looked at the house today, it was clear that they had another showing.
Yeah.
And it was a random weekday. It wasn't like we were looking at it on a weekend during an open house. It was a showing that had occurred during the week. And it was so you have to make a judgment call.
Unless you're a real estate professional, I think paying for a realtor is worth it. That's an unpopular opinion. It's painful to pay a realtor, believe me. But I think it's worth it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So because if you screw up on that transaction, that is going to be a screw up that you feel for decades.
Yeah.
So, paying 5% or 6% on the transaction just to basically increase the odds that it's a successful transaction, worth it. If you disagree, that's fine. But, I think that I'm not a real estate professional.
And I think one of the things a good realtor can do is make the transaction easy. What I'll say for my realtor as we went through was the buying process and the selling process. The negotiations, in my opinion, felt like they went well. They were straightforward. I think both parties, they say that the sign of a good agreement is that both parties feel like they lost a little bit. And I feel like I'm happy looking back at it some months later. But anyway, you talked about Redfin predictions. So some of their predictions, so they don't, I guess to clear the air, they don't predict that real estate is going to, have some massive drop. Like they don't think the housing bubble is going to burst in 2025. Now, probably have some incentive to that. They actually think, and these are kind of like stock market predictions. I roll my eyes a little bit at like stock market predictions. They always seem to predict the market's going to go up like 7 to 10% over the next year. And the number of years where the market actually goes up 7 to 10%, it's like very infrequent. So this is probably the same thing. They think housing prices are going to rise 4%. But the kicker so that may be a little bit unpopular in the sense that like anybody out there hoping for some massive drop in home prices, like because of what we said around supply, like supply is getting better, but there's still not enough.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a drop in existing home prices. We may see, and my guess is these home builders may start making concessions. So doing self-financed deals where they offer below market rates. So I could see something like that happen, or maybe they discount a little bit. So
I have a friend who's looking at similar situation. He's looking at a new build, and they're offering if he uses their financing, they'll give him $5,000 towards closing.
Yeah, I think we could see some things like that because home builders buying new homes is, you would think, the more popular way to go, but we're also running out of good location in some of these big cities. So we were mentioning earlier that these outskirt towns like Lebanon in Ohio used to be just like backwater towns. Lebanon's always been kind of nice. Not saying backwater is not accurate, but it's a small town. But now you're seeing development creep out, but it's not convenient development. And we're also seeing a time where going back to work, about going back into the office, is becoming back in vogue. So people are cautious at moving too far from their employer because, like, wait, what if I do get called back in? We know we're hearing a lot of talk about that now. If you're a federal worker, which is a whole nother tangent we won't get into. But I think that's a big issue when it comes to new builds, is that we're running out of good locations to put in neighborhoods. So you're always going to see, because of location preference, existing homes being more preferred because they're just, more convenient, honestly. That's just my
Well, in the
opinion.
neighborhoods, I mean, how many
Yeah.
new homes do you see these days where like you go to the neighborhood and it's
Mhm.
clear that like they just plowed a big field,
Yes.
put roads on it, and then threw up houses, and there's not a tree.
There's
that
no
is
character.
There's
Yeah.
and it's not to say that like I assume that these things will grow in over 30 years, but I mean it's with the pace that they're having to do this at, and they're getting out into what used to be, at least here in Ohio, they're getting out into what used to be like farmland.
Yeah.
So they're taking a lot of these essentially cleared
The
spaces.
house that I bought cannot be built today because the land is so unique and very nice. We're running out of land like that that's close to city centers. And the outskirts, yeah, absolutely. But the problem is commute. So anyway, I just think that new homes are just always going to struggle in sales relative to existing homes for that reason, just because of location. So I think you could see some new home builds offering concessions just to entice people. But you mentioned something that was off the podcast here that I want you to mention, and that is the thing that's anchoring the low inventory in existing homes right now is people not wanting to give up their 2.5-3% mortgages, but they're outgrowing these homes. They're going to get ants in their pants and want to move. And you coined a term. I'm trying to remember it.
Yeah, so I've been talking about this for, I mean, we had a podcast that we did almost a year ago now. I think it's called the equity versus liquidity trade-off. And we talked about essentially what I think about is the great capitulation.
Yes.
Where
that's it.
Even your, so I'll pick on I have an anecdotal friend right now. He's very financially savvy, very conservative with his money, knows his budget to a penny, saves money and invests money very purposefully, always been really good at it. He's now, gone from having no kids to having a child, and he's been in his house maybe a little too long. They're starting to outgrow it. And he's really thinking, gosh, like, how am I really going to get rid of my mortgage? But eventually, even the most financially conservative of people feel that pressure, right? That like, what else is my money for? I need, I want to raise my kids in a good home, things like that. So now he's looking at new houses. And so he's capitulating. I capitulated. He capitulated. You capitulated, right? Yeah. I think what we're going to see is that as time moves forward, the inevitable becomes more obvious. And people, as begrudgingly and as much as they're going to gripe about it as they do it, they're going to sell their houses. And when they do that, they're generally going to get big checks. And they're going to take that money and they're going to either put it into their new house, they're going to, pay for upgrades for the new house, whatever it is. But there is, there's an article I pulled from CNBC where they talk about how much home equity. There is $32 trillion of home equity, meaning if you take the total value of all the houses and subtract out all the loans against them, there's $32 trillion of money tied up in illiquid houses.
So you're predicting that we see a growing use of leverage to drive the market.
I think that people will sell their homes. They will get checks for doing so. And on the whole, those checks are going to allow people to continue to consume and raise their families and furnish and maintain their new homes. And I see that as a backdrop that is kind of makes it hard to have a pretty deep recession, right? So like, I think the economy could go through some ebbs and flows, but I just have, when you look at people's retirement account values, when you look at their home values, when you look at the fact that their incomes are now growing faster than inflation over the past 2 years, it's hard to see a world where like the bottom just falls out on all of this and all of a sudden people can't,
but let's say it did. If the bottom did fall out, whatever that means, then what would happen is interest rates would decline because future inflation expectations would decline, and you would see mortgage rates go down. And then what happens then? One of the things that's anchoring that the low housing inventory is low interest rates. Well, if we get lower interest rates, then that means people are going to go and sell their
They
house,
should
and they're going to
open
go
up
buy
some more
new houses,
supply.
and the whole thing gets reignited. So there's just a lot of support for the housing prices being where they are. And I think if anything, they continue to grow. Redfin predicted 4%. Who knows? It could be 3, could be 4, could be 5. If we see interest rates moderate, I'll tell you, if rates come down to the 5% level, I think this thing just goes up. I think housing prices could go up another 10, 15%. Easy.
And so back to my conversation with my friend last night, he's, stressing over, am I going to buy this house? And the challenge is eventually, like, whether he likes it or not, he's already mentally made the decision to get out of his house.
Yeah.
Right. The likelihood he's staying in his house
He just has
is
to
very low.
accept he has to do what I did and sit down and battle. I had to sit in the sauna for 25 minutes sweating over this.
Well, but here's the thing.
Do I want to pay 3 times more than what I'm currently paying?
And when you eventually capitulate in 2 years, if you didn't do it, you're probably going to pay more for the new house anyway.
The reason I did it is because I imagined how happy my wife would be.
Well, keep imagining.
Yeah. No, she is so excited. She's definitely super happy about this. And
I only joke. I joke, keep imagining, only because I think as humans, we have this inherent ability to constantly think that this thing that's out in front of us is going to all of a sudden make us happy. And then we're always let down when inevitably the happiness doesn't get sourced from the
happiness
thing.
is a temporary state. I don't think that's the purpose of life is happiness. The founding fathers made a mistake when they said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It should be the pursuit of meaning. Because really that's what people want is meaning. They don't necessarily need happiness. I mean, sometimes you get happiness if you're living a meaningful life, but sometimes living a meaningful life means a lot of pain and suffering. So anyway,
all I'm saying is, you can get the new house. I think sometimes if you're not happy, reaching for material possessions doesn't necessarily fix that.
Oh,
but
exactly.
There is something to be said for creating a positive environment and an environment that you feel is nurturing and supportive of your children and your spouse and, your life. Right. I mean, what else is the money for if you're not when I decided to buy my house, I just thought about, if you were to list the top, if you looked back at the end of your life and, you knew how much money you had to spend and here's what you spent it, how do you want to allocate it? Where does the home that you're going to raise your family in fit on that list? Is that number 1 on the list? Is that number 5 on the list? It's definitely not number 10, right? It's very close to the top of the list in terms of my priorities for what I'd like to use my money on, right? It's higher than the boat or the fancy car, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, but and it has some competition with education, right? I mean, there's things that are important, and it's not my job to tell you what's on your list, but it is important when it comes to your money. People think that wealth managers, our job is about save all your money and be really shrewd with your money, and there's an element of that if it's needed, but there's another element of it that's how do you find more meaning in your money? You're going to have, a lot of our clients that we work with, we're projecting and we're running these plans that make them multimillionaires, right? And that's great, but it's a means to an end. So what is the end? And it's so young people, millennials, when we've talked about this before, there's 74-ish million millennials. We're the largest demographic cohort in America. And guess what? We're all entering our peak spending years as we're having kids and buying
and that's
houses.
going to last a couple decades.
That is not a short-term thing. And then, by the way, the second biggest generation is the baby boomers, and they're also in a spending period of life as they...
Is Gen Z bigger than millennial? Let me ask.
No, millennials are the biggest.
Oh, wow. Millennials at 49.5 million and Gen Z is 17.1 million.
I'm saying millennials trounce everybody. So as millennials continue to grow their families, grow their income, they're inevitably looking down at their houses and feeling like they don't match. And they're wrestling with this. The same thing, by the way, is happening to baby boomers as, you've got baby boomers who are looking down going, we don't need all this space anymore. We've got a lot of home equity. We want to do a other things. They're asking bigger questions, and they want to spend their time doing things they've been saving for their whole life.
I agree. Now I'm going to look through the telescope a little further down the time horizon here, because this is one of the predictions Redfin made that I think is a little disconcerting, because home prices have gotten so expensive, rents have gotten so expensive. Now millennials, because they're entering their peak earnings years, or they're just
peak spending years,
yeah.
really. I mean, when you have kids,
yeah, they're not in their peak earning years. That happens a little bit later on, but
when you're 35,
they're making more than Gen Z is my point. And the prediction 10 that Redfin has is that Gen Z will rewrite the American dream, cutting homeownership from the script. I thought that was like the cornerstone of the American dream was homeownership. Apparently Gen Z, they're so jaded and their incomes are so trash that they need to, scrap the idea of even affording a home, which is a little sad.
Though? It is so hard to label demographics for their financial beliefs when they are in their early 20s.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, everybody, gave the millennials just such a hard time when we were young for being broke. And now it turns out the millennials are actually...
And by the way, we don't work hard. That was the other narrative, that we're lazy.
So, but like, you look at there's a stat which we can link to in the show notes, but there's a good visual capitalist piece that shows like how quickly millennials are becoming wealthier. And millennials are starting to, all of a sudden the generation that was saddled with employer or with student loans and, couldn't find jobs is actually doing pretty well for ourselves as our incomes are growing. We're starting to see the benefits of, long-term compounding and wealth is starting to transfer generationally.
Yeah. Some of the hardest working people I know out there are millennials. I just think there's always a tendency for the older generation to critique the younger generation because they have a bias. They think of themselves, they're like, well, I don't know what kind of bias you would call this, but you accomplish a lot of things and then you eventually climb to the top of the hill. And then you look back and you're looking at all the people that are still at the bottom of the hill, because they started later than you. And you think, look how lazy they are, and you forget all the times that you stopped to rest going up the hill.
Yeah.
So there's a bias. I will call this an accomplishment bias, where you get to the peak of your life and you look down and you're like, look at all those lazy people. They're just ants down there. And I think that every generation does this. The millennials are going to do this to maybe not Gen Z. It's Gen Y.
Well, it's kind of reminds me of just how your brain works with time. Like the days are long, but the years are short. The brutal, like doing something for 30 years along the way feels like a really long time, but I'm sure, and I'm young. So, I mean, I'm sure I'll learn this through experience, but like, I'm sure when you look back, I mean, certainly when I look back at the last 10 years, it's gone by like that.
Yeah.
Right. But I can tell you that as I think about how the 10 years went, it was a long time. So it's easy for you. Like your brain is pretty good at like manipulating
the reality.
The reality of it. Right.
I often say that the most powerful force that humans are capable of isn't love. It isn't hate. It's the power to convince ourselves of our own truths.
Well, I've always believed, and this goes back very closely to the home ownership decision. Like we as humans, and I've seen this in people and their money. I don't care how logical you are as a person. Decisions are made on an emotional level. And then like we are very primal about the decisions we make. I want that. Right.
Yeah.
And what we do is we have this rational part of our brain that then once our primal like piece has settled on it, has made the decision, we like impose this rational thought process to try to like sell it to ourselves.
Justify it. Yeah.
Yeah. We're just justifying our animalistic feelings. Right.
Yep, exactly.
And so anyway, I just, again, back to the core thesis, like I don't, in terms of like market predictions, I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, as we enter into 2025, we've got budget, we got debt ceilings, we've got budgets to look at, we've got tax policy to go through. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty can create volatility. Certainly there's risk. But if you look at like fundamentally what's going on with the economy, like I I don't think we've seen the end of like our friends and other people we know going, gosh, maybe I'm going to change, move.
Yep.
And whether it's retiring and that retirement account that you've had that's grown a lot over the years, or you're selling your house and you're getting your share back of that $32 trillion of home equity that's out there, like consumers and their capacity to spend isn't gone. As much as we gripe about higher prices and higher costs, people can still afford it.
Yeah.
On the whole.
Yeah. So let's put a bow on this present for our listeners here, and just
I see what you did there.
Yeah, I'm wrapping it up, baby. If you're looking at a
Even
home,
better.
If you're looking at a home and you're worried, am I buying at a peak? The answer is probably yeah, but it's always you're always achieving new peaks. But don't think that the housing market is going to collapse. The reality is that the fundamentals don't support that. And we're probably going to see a continuation of housing price creep, rent creep, just because inflation is our reality and the demographics support growing demand.
Well, let's put some CFP, certified financial planner, as a listener, to give you some actionable thoughts here.
Mm-hmm, sure.
In the financial planning textbook, there's a ratio that's called the housing cost ratio. And basically what it says is that if you add up your housing debt plus your other debt payments, so if you have a car payment, a student loan payment, a house payment, if you add all of those things together, combined, they should not exceed 36% of your gross income.
That's income before taxes.
Income before taxes, right? So, if you make $100,000 or $200,000 a year gross, multiply that by 36%. So on 100,000, that's 36,000 a year. On 200,000, that's 72,000 a year. You do not want your debt payments to be above that level. That's what the textbook would say. Everybody has a little bit different risk tolerance. I have people that wouldn't be comfortable at 36, and I have, people that would be very comfortable at 36. But that's a good rule of thumb. The other thing that I would say, just kind of financial, is like, buy the house that you see yourself in. Like we've talked about cost from transaction cost. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to, recently has tried to get a quote on work around the house. It is expensive to remodel homes. It's expensive to sell them. When you buy a house, the main benefit is that your mortgage payment, that principal and interest payment, doesn't increase year over year.
Yeah. And it's inflation resilience.
It's an inflation hedge, as we call it in investing, right? And so once you've been in the house for 5-10 years, your income has grown, your other expenses have grown, and that mortgage payment that stayed the same doesn't feel quite as expensive.
Yeah, you're locking in your housing expense. It's one of the main benefits of home ownership.
So put yourself in a position to own a home that you're not going to sell in 3 years. Focus less on, gosh, is the house $650,000 or $750,000? It's not to say that that's not relevant and you shouldn't be responsible there, but put your main focus on like where do we want to be? Because if you can buy a house and stay there for a long period of time, chances are that's going to be more financially advantageous than buying a cheaper house, but realizing it was the wrong one 3 years later.
That's a great way to end it, Brent. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yep. Catch you next time. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Any company names noted herein are for educational purposes only and not an indication of trading intent or a solicitation of their products or services. Advisors associated with National Wealth Management Group may be either 1. Registered representatives with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC, and investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group. Or 2, Solely investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group and not affiliated with LPL Financial. Investment advice offered through National Wealth Management Group, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial.